Hi everyone, Mike here from Bikes by Mike with another cycling related video. Today I'm going to guide you through the process I follow for choosing and replacing wheel hub bearings on my DT Swiss 180 hubs. I'll spend the first part of this video upstairs to talk to you about bearings before heading downstairs where the actual work will happen. Okay, let's get to it. This video is structured as a tutorial on how to replace DT Swiss hub bearings. So most of you watching now will have already decided that this is something you want to do yourself. Total respect to you all. But I'm also hoping I can convince a few of you who are sitting on the fence, because I really feel that this is the most inexpensive way to make any bike ride like new again. Before I get to how to replace wheel bearings, I'm going to explain why this is something you need to do to your bike every year or so, or at least take it to a qualified shop. Next, I'll explain how cartridge bearings are designated so you know how to go about choosing the right size and type of bearings. I'll also share my thoughts on which brands of bearings I recommend and why. I'll then show you the entire process of replacing the rear hub bearings, but I'm not going to show you how to replace the Freehub bearings as they last much longer, so it's unlikely it's something you'll have to do. But I will show you how to clean and regrease the Freehub internals, which you do need to do on a regular basis. And that'll be a wrap for this video. So the simple reason you need to replace hub bearings is that they wear out. If you ride your bike outdoors, they'll wear out, period. Yes, better quality bearings will last longer and roll more smoothly than cheaper ones, but they all wear out eventually. The wear rate depends a lot on the mileage you put on your bike and the conditions you ride in. It also depends on how you wash your bike and what types of cleaning and degreasing products you use. I typically get anywhere between 3,000 and 5,000 kilometers on my road bike before having to replace bearings, but much less on my mountain bike, say 800 to 1,000 kilometers. While the bearings on bikes do have seals to keep out contaminants, they aren't perfect. Water will eventually find its way past the seals and flush out the grease from within. Once the lubrication is gone, the metal-on-metal friction causes the ball bearings and races to wear out quickly. When dirt and grit gets past the seals, the friction created will also wear down the bearings, even if they are still packed with grease. A worn bearing cartridge is easy to spot. Just spin it between your fingers, and if it feels rough and gritty, it needs replacing. If you want to check if your hub bearings need replacing, simply remove the end caps and spin the wheel with your fingers, lodged within the bearing cartridge bore holes. You will immediately feel the roughness and vibration if the bearings are damaged. The watt savings difference between worn bearings and fresh ones depends on how badly damaged your bearings are. If they are destroyed and seized like these headset bearings on my fat bike, then the watt wastage will be noticeable. In the case of these headset bearings, I could actually feel resistance when I turned the handlebars, so I knew the bearings were wrecked. But it's rare for bearings to ever get as bad as these. If you take all 4 bearings installed on your typical wheel hubs, there's probably less than 2 watts of wastage difference between used bearings and fresh new ones, or about the same as the savings between good quality new bearings and average quality stock bearings. I'm not going to tell you to replace your bearings so that you can ride faster. That's not realistic. But I will tell you that the ride feel between a bike with heavily worn bearings and one with brand new ones is noticeable. The bike will just roll more smoothly with fresh new bearings. It's one of the main reasons that a new bike feels so nice. It just rolls along with less resistance. To me, it makes no sense to buy a nice new bike unless you plan on replacing the bearings every year or two. If you don't, that bike will feel worse than one half the price after just a couple years. So keep your bike well maintained and replace those bearings. Okay, I hope I've sold you on the idea that you need to replace your bearings. So let me move on to how you go about choosing the proper size and type of bearings and which ones you might want to consider buying. But first, it'll help to review a few common terms used in the bearing business. Most of the bearings used on a bike are what are called radial cartridge bearings, and they look like these. They have 4 main parts. You have the individual ball bearings themselves, which are held equidistant apart by a retainer, also referred to as a cage. The bearings and retainer are then sandwiched between an inner race and an outer race. Bearings used for bike applications will always have a seal on each side of the bearing cartridge to help prevent grit and moisture from reaching the bearings, which is how they wear out prematurely. When buying replacement bearings, make sure to get the ones with non-contact seals. Bearings that come without seals are only appropriate for use in very clean environments, like what you typically find in aerospace and factory applications. I'll use one of my wheel hub bearings to explain the naming convention used. The bearing code is printed on the outer seal of the bearing, but because the bearings on a bike are so small, they're often difficult to read. It's a bit easier to read the code on the box that came with my replacement NSK bearing. The first digit is the bearing type. In this case, a 6, which is used for single roll ball bearings. The next number is the diameter series. In this case, an 8, which is referred to as an extra thin, high-speed bearing. The next 2 digits represent the inner diameter of the race and is often referred to as the bore. 00 starts with a 10 millimeter bore, 01, 12 millimeters, 02, seen on this one, is a 15 millimeter bore, 03, 17 millimeter bore, 04, 20 millimeter bore, and then 5 millimeter bore increases from there. So this is a 6802 cartridge bearing, but some bearing brands insert a 1 after the first digit using a 5-digit numbering system. A 6802 bearing is the same as a 61802 bearing. Manufacturers often include a suffix after the number, but this is not standardized among brands. So you need to reference the manufacturer's technical manual. If I look up VV in the NSK manual, I see that for my bearing, it stands for non-contact seals on both sides. By comparison, SKF uses the suffix 2RS1 to identify a bearing with seals on both sides. Lastly, the 4 characters at the end are also non-standard and specific in this case to NSK bearings. If I pull up the NSK bearing table, I see that this code is used to identify the specific type of grease used in the bearing. In this case, NS High Lube, which is a high-performance grease. From this bearing code, you can use various lookup tables like this one from the bearingworks.com website to find the bearing's dimensions, which is the other way that bearings are often listed. In the case of my 6802 bearing, you can see it has an inner dimension of 15 millimeters, an outer dimension of 24 millimeters, and a width of 5 millimeters. Manufacturers will list their bearings by either the bearing code or the bearing size, but usually both will be shown. If you've already removed your bearings from your hub, you can refer to the bearing code printed on the seal. But this often isn't all that useful since you'll probably want to buy your replacement bearings before you start servicing your hub. In that case, you should refer to the technical manual for your specific hub to find the appropriate bearing code. For example, when I pull up the DT Swiss EXP technical manual for the rear hub, I can see that the drive side has a 1526 bearing and the non-drive side a 6802 bearing. And I have 2 6802 cartridge bearings for the front hub. So I need a total of 4 replacement cartridge bearings for this build. 3 6802s and 1 1526. Now that we know the size of bearings we need, there are basically 2 considerations in choosing which specific bearings to buy: the brand and the material. Let's start with the brand. Here you have a whole slew of options at a variety of different price points. If I had to give just one piece of advice, it'd be to buy bearings from a respectable brand. And how do you know if it's a respected brand? One simple test is whether their bearings are good enough to be used in the aerospace industry or for serious industrial applications. Because the standards and permitted tolerances in those industries are generally much more stringent than in the bike industry, unfortunately for us, there are a lot of non-brand name options available, many of them coming from China. Personally, I haven't had good experience with any of them. While their price is appealing, particularly for ceramic bearings, I have found that they don't run as smoothly as top-tier brands and they don't last as long. If you don't want to spend the money for the best bearings, Enduro bearings is a good, safe option for North American buyers. They aren't the best bearings out there, but they are acceptable and you know what you're getting. Plus, their selection is huge, so you can always find the right size bearing for your bike. But if you want to spend a bit more for top-tier precision bearings, you can't go wrong with NTN and NSK bearings from Japan, SKF from Sweden, or FAG from Germany. I've used them all and they all have performed exceptionally well. They're also the same top-tier brands Hamini recommends in his bearing technical guide. The second consideration is the choice of material. You have two good options here, stainless steel or ceramic. I've tried them both and I just don't see a huge performance or durability advantage by going with ceramic bearings. I simply don't think it's worth the premium price. Even if you believe Ceramic Speed's claim that 6 to 9 watts can be saved by replacing all of your hub, pulley wheels, and bottom bracket steel bearings with ceramic bearings, that doesn't seem all that impressive from a dollar spent per watt savings perspective. Upgrading from top-tier stainless steel to top-tier ceramic would cost hundreds of dollars more. And remember, when it comes to the type of ceramic bearings used on bikes, they are not full ceramic bearings, but rather hybrid bearings. Yes, the ball bearings themselves are silicon nitride, aka ceramic, but the races are stainless steel. So while the ball bearings will last a long time, the life of the cartridge bearing itself is limited by the less durable steel races. Essentially, the bearing is only as good as its weakest component. Plus, the load capacity of hybrid bearings is less than what you find with full steel cartridge bearings. Also, don't even think about trying to use full ceramic cartridge bearings on your bike. I mean those ones where the races are also ceramic. I can almost guarantee that they will all break within a few months. Not that I've ever experienced that myself, because that would be like really stupid.
What the?
Okay, you've probably heard more than you ever wanted to hear about bearings, but I just had to get that off my chest. Now I'll guide you through the process of replacing both hub bearings on a DT Swiss EXP rear hub and repacking the Freehub body with grease. First things first, let's go over the tools and parts you'll need for the job. For the rear hub, you'll need one 6802 and one 1526 cartridge bearing. If planning to do the front hub as well, you'll need two additional 6802 bearings. A DT Swiss installation cylinder for the rear non-drive side and both sides of the front hub, or you can use a 6802 drift. A DT Swiss installation cylinder for the rear drive side, or a 1526 drift. A DT Swiss EXP mounting tool for the rear drive side. Note that this tool is specific to EXP hubs, so neither the DT Swiss 3-pawl or the DT Swiss Star Ratchet ring nut tool will work for this application. A 22mm socket attached to a long-handled socket wrench, or even better, a breaker bar. A DT Swiss hub seal installation tool for the rear drive side. A DT Swiss EXP mounting tool. A DT Swiss axle tool, DT Swiss special grease for lubricating the ratchet assembly. This grease does behave differently than other greases, so I strongly suggest you use this one recommended by DT Swiss. An all-purpose bicycle assembly grease, cotton swabs or a small paintbrush, a container filled with degreaser, cleaning solvent, or isopropyl alcohol like I have here, a small brush for cleaning, rags or shop towels, a rubber mallet, and a regular hammer. Now for the tools that are optional, but these do make the process a little bit easier if you have them. Rubber gloves to keep your hands clean, a chain whip and cassette tool. These are optional if not replacing the Freehub body bearings. I don't need to remove the cassette, but I am doing it here for demonstration purposes. A bearing press. I like using it whenever possible as you eliminate any chance of misaligning the cartridge bearings when inserting them into the hub body, which can destroy a hub. A 1.5-inch PVC pipe connector and a Park Tool 668 drift or any other similar size drift. Once you have all your tools and parts on hand, you're ready to replace your hub bearings. Here's the entire process from start to end. So the first thing I want to do is remove the rotor and end cap. So I'll grab my cassette lock ring removal tool, as well as a 15/16 inch or 24mm socket. Connect my breaker bar to it and lefty-loosey remove it. Once the lock ring's removed, I can then lift up the rotor, remove the end cap, and flip over the wheel so that I can now work on the cassette. Since we're not replacing the Freehub bearings in this video, the cassette does not have to be removed, but I'm doing it anyway here just for the purpose of demonstration. So I'll grab my cassette lock ring removal tool, insert it in the lock ring, add my chain whip. I find it works best if you do it on the third cog down. Attach my socket and breaker bar, lefty-loosey, and remove the lock ring. Now you can unwind it by hand, remove the lock ring, remove the chain whip, and carefully lift off the cassette and set it aside. Now I'll give the rotor mounting spline as well as the exterior Freehub body a quick cleaning and rub down with a shop towel. Don't have to be that careful here, just get most of the grease off, so it'll make the whole process a lot less messy. We'll now remove and disassemble the Freehub, grab it with both hands and pry it off. And you can remove the end cap and set that aside in a safe place. You can see here the Freehub is a bit dirty inside, but a quick cleaning will fix that. We'll now remove the red washer. You may need a pick to pry it out. And set that aside and let it soak in your cleaning solution. And again, just a quick look at the internals of the hub. Set that aside, and now we can remove the parts from the axle, starting with the spring, followed by the ratchet. It's a bit greasy and dirty, but it's not too bad. Hasn't been used that much. And then we'll remove the spacer, the red spacer. You may need a shop towel to do that. And that's it for the axle side. Now it's time to remove the axle and the bearing on the non-drive side. And there's basically three ways to do this. The first two are ones recommended by DT Swiss. You can take a soft-faced hammer and knock out the axle on the drive side. Or you can take the DT Swiss axle tool, insert in the axle, and with a regular hammer, knock it out on the drive side. This is often debated, but the safest way to remove bearings, in my opinion, is to use a bearing press. So that's what I'll do here. I'll grab my 1.5 inch PVC connector and my Park Tool 6x8 drift, insert inside, as well as a 1526 drift, or pretty much any drift will work. Add one end of the press, the other end, and tighten it, which will extract the bearing. A few turns and it's done. I can remove the bearing press and remove the axle with the bearing. And I'll remove that bearing from the axle. Now we'll remove the EXP ratchet from the hub by first inserting the axle through the non-drive side. This will help keep the tool aligned. We'll add the DT Swiss installation cylinder on the non-drive side, again to help keep the alignment correct. And we'll grab our DT Swiss EXP ratchet removal tool, insert it, grab our 22mm socket, and attach our breaker bar to it, and lefty-loosey, we can remove it. Now this will be very tight. It's actually quite loose here, but that's because I've loosened it off camera. And you can unwind it by hand, remove the tool, and remove the axle with the ratchet and the bearing, which is still inside of the ratchet, as you can see here. Now we'll remove the bearing from the EXP ratchet by pushing it out away from the teeth section of the ratchet. We'll insert it into the DT Swiss EXP mounting tool, insert the short end of the axle, and then as per the DT Swiss instructions, you can tap it out. But my preference, as I mentioned earlier, is to use a bearing press whenever possible, so I'll do that here. I'll again grab my PVC connector, insert the EXP ratchet assembly, into the PVC. Insert the short end of the axle into the bearing. Insert one end of the bearing press into one side. I'll grab my Park Tool drift 668, insert it. Add another drift to 1526 or any other to make a snug fit. And then screw in the handle of the press. And then I'll slowly tighten to extract the bearing from the EXP ratchet. And then disassemble the bearing press. And then there it is. I have the bearing extracted from the EXP ratchet. Now I'll inspect the Freehub seal to make sure it's still in good working condition, and it should be, and does not normally have to be removed unless it's damaged. If it is damaged and has to be removed, you can use a small screwdriver, insert it within a small notch below the seal, and pry out the seal. Grab a new seal, insert it, and then use the DT Swiss hub seal installation tool and give it a whack with a hammer, and then it's set. Now I'm going to give the hub and the Freehub a good cleaning. So grab a shop towel and give the internals a really good wipe down on both sides. And as you can see here, the internal of the hub is now pretty clean. I can now start to work on the Freehub internals. So the parts that you previously removed, you can now grab a brush, wipe them clean. Once that's done, wipe them all dry to remove any cleaning residue. Now I'll insert my new 1526 bearing into the EXP ratchet. I'll place the ratchet into the EXP mounting tool. And bearings often have a black seal and an orange seal. The orange seal is the one that faces out away from the hub. So in this case, I insert the black portion upwards. And you can tap it in with a soft-faced hammer. But again, I like to use a bearing press wherever possible, so that's what I'll do here. I'll start off by lubricating the bearing as well as the internals of the EXP ratchet. Insert the bearing orange face inwards, black seal facing outwards. Make sure it's perpendicular to the EXP ratchet. Grab a 1526 drift and insert it into the bearing. And then fit the bearing press in through the bearing. Add the Park Tool 668 drift, as well as another 6802 drift or any other that fits. And then tighten the bearing press until the bearing is seated. Just needs to be snug, no need to over tighten it. Once it's seated, you can then disassemble the bearing press, and you'll be able to see that the bearing is now nicely seated in the EXP ratchet. Now we'll install the EXP threaded ratchet onto the hub by first applying some thin all-purpose grease to the axle spindle. And you can also grease the ratchet, but not the teeth, just the exterior and the bearing side. We'll grab our axle, and on the short end, we'll add the DT Swiss installation cylinder and fish the long end through the hub, making sure the long end is sticking out of the drive side of the hub. Grab your EXP threaded ratchet, put it onto the axle and threaded it by hand initially. Then grab your DT Swiss EXP mounting tool, insert that over the axle. Again, do it by hand if you want to get started. You have to put a bit of pressure to push it past the hub seal. And once it's finger tight, you can then grab your 22mm socket, attach to your breaker bar, and then you want to tighten this as tight as possible. You don't have to go super tight here, in that once you actually start pedaling, you're going to even tighten it even more, which is why it's so difficult to remove. Now we want to mount the 6802 bearing on the non-drive side. So I'll use a PVC connector just to hold the wheel in place, and I'll add some regular grease to the inside of the hub where the bearing will seat. I'll grab my new 6802 bearing, remove it from the box, and apply some grease to the sides as well as the face of the bearing to try to keep out the dirt. And I'll carefully seat it inside. And DT Swiss say that you can simply install this by grabbing your DT Swiss installation cylinder and tapping the bearing in place. Once again, I prefer to use a bearing press for this job. I'll add my Park Tool 6x8 drift to my bearing tool, attach my PVC connector and the bearing tool through the drive side. On the non-drive side, I'll add my 6802 spacer and my 6802 drift. Screw in the other side of the bearing press. And now I'll press the bearing in place until it's snug but not over tightened. You get a sense just by feel when it's tight enough. And now I'll disassemble the bearing press. And that's it. Now you want to spin the wheel to make sure the axle spins freely. If it's tight, the bearing has probably been pressed in too tightly. You need to tap the opposite side of the axle to loosen it just slightly. If there's lateral play in the axle, then you need to press the bearing in harder. Now you want to set the hub seal to make sure it's snug and in place. So grab your hub seal tool, insert it over the axle. Grab your DT Swiss installation cylinder and also place that over the axle. And then grab a hammer and just give it a few whacks to seat the hub seal. Now it's time to lubricate the Freehub body. I'll grab some DT Swiss special grease and a paintbrush and apply it to the threaded ratchet as well as the loose ratchet and apply the grease on all sides. Then I'll grab some regular all-purpose grease and give a quick lubrication to the spacer and slide that onto the axle. I'll grab my ratchet and then put that over the axle, as well as the spring, followed by the red washer. I'll add some DT Swiss special grease to the internals of the Freehub and some regular grease to the inside of the bearing. And then slide the Freehub body over the axle, make sure it's snug and spins freely. Add some regular grease to the exterior of the Freehub bearing. Try to protect it from water penetration. Snap on the end cap. If you removed the cassette originally, it's time to reinstall it, starting with the largest cogs. And you can align, there's a large notch which aligns with a large notch on the Freehub. And with many of the Shimano cassettes, you can see it as is marked here with an arrow. So installing them in the proper order with the proper spacers. And then grab the lock ring and screw it on by hand initially. Then grab the Shimano lock ring tool, insert it into the lock ring, screw it in by hand. Then grab your 15/16 inch socket or 24mm socket, along with your torque wrench set to, in this case, 40 Newton meters of force, and tighten it. The last step is to reinstall the rotor. Starting with the end cap, I'll give it a light greasing, the sides and the end, to help keep water away from the bearing. Snap it onto the hub. Slip the rotor onto the splines of the hub. Screw in the lock ring. Set a torque wrench to 40 Newton meters of force and tighten it to spec. So that's pretty much it for how you go about replacing DT Swiss 180 EXP rear hub bearings. If you nailed this one, you'll easily be able to handle the front hub. With the right tools and the right bearings, it really isn't that hard. That's all I got for today, folks. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and share it with your friends. And if you're not subscribed to this channel, please subscribe, as it allows me to produce more content for all of you. See you next time. Happy rolling.